Oh, glad to see you all. It's a great afternoon here. We have a long, important study. We'll get to it right away. Reg, would you pray for us today?
Certainly. Father in heaven, we thank you for this opportunity to come together, to study your word, to learn of Revelation, what it truly means. Please grant us the presence of the Holy Spirit,
Amen.
not just currently, but also to those who watch these videos in the future. And we
Amen.
thank you for doing so. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. All right, let's get right to it. Thanks for the many positive comments. I really appreciate that. The thing I want everyone to think about is that Revelation pictures a time when everyone on earth can be on the same page. What I mean is that what happens in Taiwan or Yemen can be known and understood by people in Mongolia, and Kathmandu, and Botswana too. And they will fully understand the implications that those events have on their particular situation. No such time ever existed. It did not exist when Revelation was sent to the Christians in Asia. No such time ever existed. With the most recent satellite placements, by private entities, by the way, the world is almost entirely wired. Now the electronics must be placed on the ground so that everyone can make a final decision for good or evil at the same moment. And we cannot discount the demonic activity by means of their UFO pretense that they are aliens come to protect us from ourselves, as they've already claimed to a lot of people. A number of people who've been guested on a ride on a UFO and have been properly probed have been told, well, we're here, the cedars of your race, God sent us to save you from yourselves. All right, so we know that things are moving right along. We now are faced with such global crises as overpopulation. Remember, the globalists intend to way lower the population. They're going to do it by force. God's going to take care of that for them. Rising sea levels and tsunamis, worldwide pandemics, earthquakes, fires, floods, and famines from global warming, etc. And as far as global warming is concerned, regardless of what you believe is the cause, it is happening. It is happening. Are you aware that there's an ice shelf in Antarctica that is sitting on nothing, it's floating, that is larger than the state of Florida and is weakening and cracking open rapidly? The problem with this is when it goes entirely into the ocean and tends to be carried by the current into warmer waters, it's going to melt. And that one Ross ice shelf will raise the sea level around the world by about 2 feet. I don't know why they're building all those beautiful condos on the shore. Right? All right. All right. When you think that so many of the barrier islands that we love are only 10 feet high, and a lot of the people and buildings and so forth are at the 5-foot level, well, there's going to be some problem there. But the point is that no one nation or group of nations can solve these crises, even if there was, I should have said were, subjunctive, even if there were a will to do so. We'll have to change that, right? Subjunctives mean conditions contrary to fact. There is not a will to do this, and there won't be until the Antichrist rises. Before we consider the last verse of Revelation 11, which forms the capstone of the great reprophesying and the spectacular career of the two witnesses, we need to look at a graph that contains all of the information we need to know to understand this near future event. A graph is a kind of picture, and we know that a picture equals 1,000 words or more. So even if you've never been exposed to the 70-week prophecy which we went through lickety-split last week of Daniel 9:24-27, you can understand what's going on in Revelation 11. In the first final week of years, from fall AD 27 to fall AD 34, that's 7 years long, John the Baptist and Jesus witnessed to the Jewish nation. That's the first half. Their message was rejected. In the second half of that 7 years, the officials would try to destroy the gospel. At the last moment, the most ardent persecutor was accosted by Christ, that was Saul, and ordered to oversee bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. It was a most unexpected outcome, both good and bad, ever seen. And that was in 34 AD, when the 70 weeks of years ran out on corporate Jewish probation. I didn't say Jewish probation. Did you get that? I said corporate Jewish probation. Paul writes very clearly in Romans that all the natural branches were cut off the tree, and then some wild olive branches were grafted in, and some natural branches were grafted back in, making the new Israel. Okay, here's the 70th week. This is the past one. Daniel 9:20. Over there on your left is the beginning marker, 27 in the fall. Over on the right at the end is 34 in the fall. The first half of is 3.5 years, or 1,260 days, or 42 months, all of which are mentioned in Revelation. When you get halfway through a 7-year period and you start in the fall, you end up in the spring. Right, Ray? Okay, so 3.5 years later, in the spring of AD 31, Christ was crucified in our behalf. Then he ascended to heaven, and persecution was officially started. The nation, under its leadership, rejected the gospel. Christ was a deceiver. He hadn't been resurrected. His body was stolen, so forth. So that's what we're looking at here. That's a simple explanation of what the 70th week was like in the past. Dispensationalists do not teach this. They are very confused about where, if you start with the actual third decree in 457 BC, these are the years you come out to, exactly the years that we would expect. All right? Now, here's the 70th week. It's cyclic, as it's going to look in the future according to Revelation 10 and 11. All right? We still have a period of 7 years, or 1,260 days, or 42 months. Again, mentioned very distinctly in the book of Revelation, chapters 10 and 11. You see the question marks by the beginning and end of the 7 years? There's a specific event. I'm not going to mention it just yet. There's a specific event that will start this 7 years. I know what it is. It's distinctly laid out in prophecy, but we will know when we enter the 7 years of the Great Tribulation. There won't be any question about it. Now let's look at the chart again. In the first half, we hear about the 2 witnesses and the churches that support them, Smyrna and Philadelphia. Good? All right. They control, and I put the word control because they really do control the events. They can smite the earth as often as they desire, with every plague, it says. Okay? All right? That makes people who don't accept their message very angry. All right? And at the end of that 3.5 years, or 42 months, or 1,260 days, they are killed. Now, what happened when Jesus was killed? He rose again. That's exactly what we have in Revelation 11. After 3.5 days, the 3.5 days is every day for the years of their prophecy. They rise, and everybody in the world knows it because there's a camera trained on them, and that all the nations will know that they're gone for good. We can breathe a sigh of relief because they're not going to rise again. We'll let their bodies rot right there so everybody can feel secure. Unfortunately, that's the worst thing they could do, and that's exactly what they will do. Because that means that everybody will watch the resurrection and ascension of the two witnesses. That's bad news.
It'll be headline news.
Yeah, you won't even need to learn about it by the headlines because you'll be watching it. This will be a really horrible piece of news for the dwellers on earth. We've gotten used to that phrase being what the standard phrase in Revelation is for the lost population of the world, the great mass of the people. And so Antichrist is in control. They have held the Antichrist off for 3.5 years. But now in the second half, the Antichrist is in complete control. This is where he finally takes over the other nation. There's two great nations, great empires struggling. But finally he gets control of the whole world because, why? Because he's going to fix stuff. He says he's God's man, and there'll be supernatural events. It says, Paul writes to the Thessalonians, that the coming of the Antichrist is by the supernatural exertion of Satan, and that there will be signs and wonders, supernatural events, the real thing, miracles. Well, Satan and his host are angels. They don't have the limitations of human beings. Certainly they can do what would look to us like supernatural things by the exertion of Satan. And the word for exertion there is something that is used only of Satan and God. This is something that humans can't do. All right, one of the things that's going to happen is the U.S. will eventually become a Christian nation. That's been happened and attempted in the American past. I know you don't know that, but we'll look at it. There was an attempt in the past to name it a Christian nation and impose a series of Christian nation laws pushed by the rising Antichrist. Such actions are laws that forbid the authority of God over the state. Okay, that will begin the final week of years. All right, so that's all you need to know for now. That's a brief overview of the main events of the great reprophesying, Revelation 10, and the authority of the two witnesses over the world in Revelation 11. Now, the question that we left was, we have seen the throne of God in Revelation, right? We've seen the very throne of God, and it's surrounded by the 4 living creatures and the 24 elders and millions of the great multitude that no man could number, and around them 100 million angels, okay? So it's a pretty big room. All right? But then, as a capstone to all this, as the conclusion of all this, telling you what it was all about, suddenly we have a verse that says, God's temple in heaven was opened, and the ark of his covenant was seen. Okay? The ark of the covenant, second paragraph, was created in the first 6 months that Israel was encamped beneath Mount Sinai. I mean the real Mount Sinai in Arabia, that is. Not the one on the Sinai Peninsula. That ain't it. The book of Exodus recounts the building of the wilderness sanctuary as a tent shrine or portable temple for God to dwell among Israel. Now modern academia has badly misstated the Exodus. Most scholars date it, if they even think anything like this even happened, which most doubt, to the reign of Ramses II around the year 1290 BC. That's not the date that the Bible's inner chronology gives. And here's the reason why. Let me tell you why they misstated. When the great storage cities, by storage cities I mean great cities where granaries and equipment was stored, in the Nile Delta, and that's where Israel lived. They weren't scattered for all the 600 miles of the Nile Valley. The Exodus and all the events there weren't scattered over 600 miles. They were right there, right? Not very far from the capital of Lower Egypt, Memphis. All right? it says in Exodus chapter 1 that the cities that Israel built while they were enslaved were the storage cities of Pithom and Ramses. And according to archaeology, the cities of Exodus 1:11 says that's what the cities that Israel built. And those were built under Pharaoh Ramses, a pharaoh even greater and more powerful than Tutmosis, but you see 160 years later. Does it make a difference? Well, suppose we dated the date of the Declaration of Independence, not to 1776, but 160 years later. Well, let's see, that would take us to 1866, about 1926. Would there be a problem of saying that the American Revolution came in 1926? When you heard the stories of how it happened, and you looked at 1926, wouldn't you be kind of mystified if that really happened?
Yes, you'd be confused.
Well, I hear the stories about what happened in the American Revolution, but I also go back to 1926, and it doesn't look like any such thing could happen or even could have happened. Okay, the Bible says that the Exodus happened in 1450, in the 18th dynasty, not 1290, in the 19th dynasty. There's a huge difference. Okay, so now I can tell you what it is. It's the last sentence here. But there is evidence, archaeological evidence, at those sites of earlier cities beneath. Okay, you're living much later, when the cities are named Pithom and Ramses. And you say, those are the sites that Israel built. You're using the current names, right? That's what you do. I seldom refer to New Amsterdam on Manhattan Island. Right? And I want to explain to you, New Amsterdam, you know, where they built a wall across here so that the Indians on the upper island wouldn't be tempted to come and massacre them. That's why we have a street named Wall Street. Okay, right? But there's no Indians in New Amsterdam on the upper part of this Manhattan Island, right?
All depends on your definition of an Indian.
That's true. All right, so I see. You think that no scholar believes that the book of Exodus was written at the time of the Exodus. It always refers to Moses in the third person. It's about the Exodus, okay? And it's using the events and names them by the name. When do most scholars believe most of this great, vast oral history was reduced to writing and turned into great scrolls? Most will tell you that at least by the unification of the Hebrews under David, we get this, what we call the Law of Moses. Well, why is it called the Law of Moses? Because Moses was given laws, it tells us. And he was told to write down those laws and transmit them to the people. But let me tell you, a lot of those laws are about what happens in cities and villages. Was Israel living in cities and villages during the Exodus? No. So those laws, some of those laws, picture a time when the local villages, under the control of a local city-state, were kind of independent unto themselves. It's not a monarchy either. Well, the period of the Judges was 400 years long. Right? So we have a mix of a bunch of laws that clearly come from a desert society. Those originated when God told Moses, this is what I want. Okay, now we've got a collection of laws, and it's got a title on it, the Laws of Moses, right? Now when you add more laws, the title is still what? The Laws of Moses, right?
Absolutely.
And then finally we get this whole corpus of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And tradition says this was written by Moses. Right? Okay. That's how it happened. I'll tell you, there are lots of Psalms in the book of Psalms that do not reflect the time of David. Why, we've even got a psalm about how they wept by the rivers of Babylon. That's 500 years later. But it's in a book called the Psalms of David. Well, why? Because he was a great singer. And he loved the great music that the temples in Egypt had. He wanted that for God's temple, right? So he gathered them together, right? At his death, he was called Israel's sweet singer, right? And he was lucky that he liked to sing to himself out there in the wilderness with the sheep, because that saved his life. He discovered that when Saul grew crazy and tried to kill him, if he sang to Saul, what happened? The king calmed down. That's why there was a King David. There wouldn't have been a King David if he couldn't sing well, right? Okay, so when I start adding Psalms into the collection, it's still called what? The Psalms of David. And so you will assume, as any fundamentalist does, that David wrote them all, right? Oh, well, this thing about the rivers of Babylon, he must have been prophesying. That's how a fundamentalist gets around the obvious, all right? Okay, so what I've told you now is that we need to know, in order to find evidence for the Exodus, we need to know when it happened. Modern scholarship has found no evidence for the Exodus. Where are they looking?
The wrong place.
They're looking under the control of Ramses the Great in 1290 BC. And so I can assure you that modern academia will never find evidence of the Exodus, right?
Right.
And by the way, when you start something like a tradition, like an academic tradition, it becomes a religion. The hardest thing to change, I know for sure, is to change a religious tradition, right? And I would like, at some point in the future, I will have a conversation with Joachim Fiore. And I will tell him, you became the most influential interpreter of prophecy for the next, when was he? At the end of the 12th century? For the next nearly 1,000 years. And it made my job really hard. I will tell him that. It's only a matter of time. The Bible's internal dating, I'm on a slide which says the temple on Zion began to function 480 years after the Exodus. And so, I'll tell you what we have. We have an exact date, 853 BC, the Battle of Karkar. The Assyrians were fighting, the other city-states were. Ahab contributed 10,000 men and 2,000 chariots. We have this event from 3 different calendars. That's called an absolute date. When we're looking to figure out when things happened, we start with an absolute date and we work forward and backward from there. Okay? So we know what year the temple began, and we can work backward 480 years and say, oh, the Exodus is in 1450 BC, and that, according to the high chronology, was the last year of Tutmosis the Great. Yeah, I'm not surprised. All right, that means that Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted Moses, would be Hatshepsut, whose co-ruler and eventual heir, Tutmosis III, tried to erase from reality. For about 20 years, Hatshepsut ruled with Tutmosis III. And it was a period of great prosperity and peace. But she disappears from history, and all her cartouches are chipped out, except they missed a few. They missed a few, so we know when she was reigning. But Tutmosis tried to erase her from existence, because if your name goes, then you don't exist. She had taken the throne apparently under a crisis, perhaps the discovery that her so-called son was in fact a Hebrew who had murdered an Egyptian taskmaster for abusing a Hebrew. In that crisis, Moses had to flee for his life. That left Hatshepsut without the man she had planned to be the next pharaoh, and indicates why she became the only, I should say the only significant female. There were 2 or 3 others who are named, but this is the 18th dynasty. This is the real thing. Her great funerary temple, she's the only significant female to claim that title. But she wasn't the only one who's mentioned. The important factor is that the 18th dynasty was one of the great high points in Egyptian history, and indeed ancient history generally. This is the real thing. People talk about this. Academics think about it, write about it, argue with each other about this period. This is the most fascinating period. If you're not in the 18th or 19th dynasty, yeah, okay, you found all these mummies, beautifully preserved from the Roman period. Yeah, sure, okay, whatever. Right? That's how that is seen. Right? Okay, well, we're trying to find out what this chamber means in the Great Pyramid. Yeah, okay. Let us know when you're done. Right? That's not where the interest lies. The Lord tells Pharaoh that he has raised him up to get glory over him and magnify his name worldwide. In fact, Moses explained Moses is a verb, to draw out. Okay? And so Exodus says, well, because he was drawn out of the Nile. Right? And really, that's just a Hebrew adjustment to the Moses of the pharaonic name. They don't add that because there's a God in front of that. Tutmosis, right? So you won't find in the Hebrew Bible the whole name. He would have dropped that part of the name long since, 40 years since. The important point here is that these are the great figures of one of the most fabulous periods of ancient Egypt, the 18th dynasty. And here's the Exodus, right in the heart of this, right where academia loves to discuss. Why don't they see the evidences, and I just said there is evidences, of the Exodus when they're looking at it all the time? Because you don't find what you're not looking for. Right? First of all, it never happened. We're talking about academics. It never happened. This is all nonsense, right? All these supernatural things that destroyed Egypt. That never happened. There's no slave rebellion. We don't see any slave race, much less 1 million people.
Yeah, besides, those books are all just fiction.
Well, you can't do it. You can't do 1 million people leave Egypt in an Exodus. Well, that's more people than there were in Egypt, right? That never happened. All right. Second paragraph. In the following slide are the high chronology dates for the 18th dynasty. Now, the high chronology, here we go. There are 2 chronologies, a high one and a low one, obviously. And there's one in between, I should say. there's this Memphite theology. Memphite means what they taught in Memphis. Memphis was the capital of Lower Egypt. And it unites a bunch of gods. It's somebody trying to take these disparate myths and work them all together in one giant myth. Okay? And it's really a raising up the high god is for Memphis. Okay? All right? And it tells us right at the beginning when this was written. And this Memphite production was found in the Karnak temple in Luxor, way down south. So, if these dates, which are dates about what the sun and moon and stars are doing, if these dates are correct, then the low chronology is correct. If this, we don't care. We don't care that it was found in the Karnak temple in Luxor. We say, no, if it's all glorifying the Memphite gods, then it was made in Memphis. So now you have to go over to Memphis and tell us in those years what was the sun doing and the moon, right? Okay. And that will give us a different chronology. The high chronology used to be widely accepted. Today, the low chronology is widely accepted. Okay? And what am I telling you? I'm telling you that the high chronology exactly agrees with the biblical chronology. And we note the kings who experienced the Exodus, massive shaming of the Egyptian gods, especially the great god Amun of Thebes. We're going to look at the famous Tutankhamun, who's, oh, see that? Amun, Tutankhamun? Tutankhamun. Well, here he is long after the Exodus, still with the official god name of Amun, whose brief reign was overlooked and his tomb left with its incredible furnishings left intact. Well, sort of intact. So grave robbers broke in, but for whatever reason, they never came back. They must have gotten caught. And the punishment for that was death. But what I'm telling you is this stuff looked like new. Well, why did it look like new? Because it was beautifully made, and then what?
Sealed.
And then who touched it later? Nobody. See, we're talking about the 1450s BC, right? Even though the tomb had been penetrated by tomb robbers. And all of this is going to be about the Ark of the Covenant. We're in that last verse. Suddenly the Ark appears, and we want to know, what is that about? Why do we need to look at everything in Revelation 10 and 11 in the light of the Ark of the Covenant? After all, the Ark of the Covenant represents God's throne. We've seen the real throne. What is this doing here? And the key last verse of Revelation 10 and 11, the great re-prophesying and the two witnesses. All right, here they are. Here's our greats right here. The founder, Ahmose, Amunhotep, Tutmosis, Tutmosis II, Queen Hatshepsut, 1504 to 1483, a co-regency with her nephew who clearly murdered her. We don't have proof of that, but there's pretty much, every so often we get into a huge argument about, is this mummy of an older woman, is this, because of course Hatshepsut's sarcophagus, beautiful sarcophagus there, but there was no Hatshepsut in it. She was erased from history. That can only have happened because one person wanted it that way. Tutmosis III, 1504 to 1450. The early part of his reign, 20 years, was a co-regency. He died in 1450. According to the Exodus account in the Bible, that happened in 1450. Now notice, there were two pharaohs at that year. Why? Because they were a co-regency. This man Tutmosis III, had been reigning for 54 years in the year of the Exodus. Can you think of any kings who reigned for a long, long time? Anyone?
David reigned for 40 years.
Who? Oh, yeah, I'm not thinking of that. Give me somebody in history.
Go with Queen Elizabeth.
What?
Queen Elizabeth.
Queen Elizabeth reigned for a lot of years and became more and more powerful as she reigned. And that's true of which Elizabeth? Both of them. Can you tell me about a French king who reigned this long?
Louis the which one?
Well, who was the great one? Louis the what? Who could say laughingly, after me comes the deluge? Who could say, not laughingly, I am the state? Louis the 14th. When you get to the point of Louis the 14th, nobody would challenge him. Nobody dared challenge him. People who challenged him disappeared very quickly and horribly. All right? Tutmosis III was the greatest king up to his reign. And he reigned for 54 years. Amenhotep II was his co-regent from 1453 to 1416. 3 years before Tutmosis finally died. And naturally, he had to worry about this. By this time, he had so many sons. What was going to happen? Egypt was going to be torn apart when he died. So he chose his successor, made him Pharaoh, and this Pharaoh was away in 1450. What do you mean he was away? He was up in Syria defending the northern border of the Egyptian Empire. The capital was in Luxor and Thebes. But this all happened in Memphis, and I'll tell you why. There was a road along the Mediterranean called in Latin the Via Maris. And it ended up in Memphis, the old capital of Lower Egypt. And that's where the resupply would be going on. More men, more food, more weapons. So his business was not in the national capital in Thebes. He came down there to Memphis to be the other end of the supply line. And I understand that after 54 years, he was too old to be conducting warfare, right? Yeah. All right. So this also means something very interesting. When Moses and Aaron showed up, this most mighty of all kings up to his own reign was not well protected. Why? The army, the great army of Egypt was in Syria. But he was still the Pharaoh, and of course he would still have a contingent of the Egyptian army, right? Mm-hmm. All right. So, if we say that the Exodus began as Tutmosis died, that he died, well, but wait a minute, his body is in the Egyptian museum in Cairo. Well, it tells us explicitly that they could look across the Yam Suf and see the bodies of the Egyptians all scattered on the shore. If you're an Egyptian and your pharaoh died, what would you go looking for right away? You got to get the body because it's a god. You got to mummify it so it lasts forever. All right? That's not a good argument against this. Now, Tutmosis IV, from 1416 to 1407. Now, remember, if we have 40 years in the wilderness, we'd go from 1450 to 1410. Mm-hmm. That means the entry into Canaan would have been sometime around, Tutmosis IV, Amenhotep III is coming onto the scene around 1407 as the sole ruler. So that means if we allot 40 years to the the conquest that Joshua began, right? That Joshua began. He was old. He did a rapid thing. He was old. But it continued. And the book of Judges makes that pretty clear. If we say, well, 1450 to 1410, 40 years. Then 40 years for the attempted conquest of Canaan. From 1410 to what? To 1370. Now look at that. Amun-Hotep IV comes on the scene in 1370. Now what this means is they're getting cries for help from the Canaanite city-states. Egypt owns the Canaanite city-states. That's their stuff. That's where they receive lots of goods and services because you pay tribute to your overlord, right? They had the business of not having Canaan conquered, and so far, how had it worked out? Since Tutmosis III, Amenhotep II, Tutmosis IV, Amenhotep III, have the pharaohs been successful in containing this power that wrought havoc on Egypt? Amenhotep IV. Amenhotep IV is famous. He's called the heretic king. He decided that for reasons unknown to Egyptologists, for absolutely no good reason, and there's tremendous argument among scholars about why this happened. And I'm going to say, your answers so far are wrong. I know why this happened. This king comes to the throne and is not happy with the god Amun, the great sun god. Amun-Ra. By this time, different myths have been solidified, right? The myths about Ra, the myths about Amun have been put together. And anyway, Amun-Ra is now the great sun god, right? Okay. How has he done on protecting Egypt and its territory?
It's failed.
Amenhotep IV, for no reason, abandoned the great Luxor temple in Thebes, abandoned Thebes itself, and built a new capital 100 miles away. There's 2 peaks there, and the sun came up between the peaks. I know why he chose it. And he called this place, this new capital, Akhetaten. Akhetaten means the horizon of the Aten, the sun disk. And you'll see his name there, Aten. See the end there, Aten? That's the sun disk. Now, he was called the heretic king. How did the priests in Thebes, the priests of Amun, feel about this? Were they happy?
No. No.
It was the richest and biggest temple in the world, right? I can see that as you go through pharaoh after pharaoh, the pharaohs are increasingly unhappy that Amun has not stopped these people. In Akhetaten, not the name of the pharaoh, but the name of the city, Akhetaten, in the city, were found a number of cuneiform tablets. The Egyptians didn't write in cuneiform. Well, they're letters from all over the place. Some great kings and other great empires, like the Hittite Empire, were corresponding. But among these were a number of appeals from the kings of city-states in Canaan, saying, the Hapiru are marauding. That's what Hapiru means. They're wrecking your place. They're taking we're not safe. Please send troops. Akhenaten did nothing that we know of, except that he changed gods. I got it. You're looking for a more powerful way to deal with this problem. Throwing more money, more men, more goods at it is not Amenhotep IV Akhenaten's answer. You hear all the time from Egyptologists, he apparently didn't do anything. Right? He didn't do anything. No, I think you missed the point. He did the one thing that he thought might work. I gotta get a better God. Clearly, at this point, Amun isn't going to do it. All right? Are we still talking about the Ark of the Covenant? We sure are. Now, the Amarna letters. In the 19th century, somebody discovered the ruins of a great city. We don't know exactly how Akhenaten met his end. You know about his famous wife Nefertiti, right? You've seen the beautiful bust of Nefertiti, which means the beautiful one is here, right? Some people think she was the real motivator behind this. He looks sickly. He looks like, some have theorized he had Marfan's syndrome. Well, he still had a lot of children, including children not by Nefertiti, okay? All right? So with her, she bore a lot of girls. But you know what the pharaohs did with their daughters, right? They chose one to be the next wife. And from that would come the heir. We know for sure that this young king here, Tutankhamun, down at the bottom, was biologically the son of, because we had the sisters, so they could trace back. He is the biological son of Akhenaten, the heretic king. And notice what it says down there at the bottom. He was born Tutankhaten. Well, that's not the name we know him by. His father disappears. He was doubtless murdered. We just don't know by who. I'll tell you this, I know this. I may not know who did it, but I know who was behind it. The priests of Amun, right? They abandoned, when Tutankhamun came to the throne, he was 9 years old. This period between his daddy, Amenhotep IV Akhenaten, and him, Smenkhara, Nefernuaten. Well, that at least has the Aten, so that must have been somebody on his side. But who were these people? What was the extent of their power? What was their real purposes? Still argued over. Probably always will be. Tutankhamun, 1347 to 1338, that's nearly 10 years. Born Tutankhaten, died Tutankhamun. Okay? Died suddenly. Oh, there's another issue. Did he fall out of his chariot, as some people believe? Or was he murdered? His whole left side is crushed. What was going on here? We don't know. Okay. He was buried with full honors as a true god. All right. So, at some point, well, in those 10 years, between his being 9 years old and 19 years old, his name was changed to Tutankhamun. They went back to Thebes, and they tore the city apart. The city was only used for 20 years, and that we can go and reconstruct. You can see these pictures that show you what it looked like and so forth, because it's all right there. It was never touched again. And here, a name given to that site today is Amarna. The Akhenaten this capital city is called today in Arabic El Amarna. And that's why it's called the Amarna letters. Here they found these cuneiform documents saying, among other things, many other things, will you please, it's your loss, will you please send troops to protect us from the Hapiru? Since Hapiru means marauders, most people will tell you, well, this isn't the Exodus as described in the book of Exodus. This is just a slave revolt of some point, of some type going on in Palestine. It means marauder. Okay. Well, I think it's too curious that the Hebrews would adopt that as their name and the name by which they would be known to other nations. You mean the Hapiru aren't our Hebrews? Maybe that name was applied to other people before this. But when these people at this particular time say the country is overrun by the Hapiru, that's too good a coincidence. And what do I want to say about coincidence? We see from the high chronology, which accords with the Bible's own inner chronology, that Tutankhamun was born a little more than 100 years after the Exodus. His father, Amenhotep IV, had conducted a religious revolution against Amun of Thebes. He adopted a new god, the sun disk Aten, and deserted Thebes and the Amun temple in favor of the splendid new city Akhetaten. He then ordered that the sun disk Aten be the only, this happened gradually. First, the Aten was named the high god, superseding Amun-Ra, and then the only god, and he was its worshiper. And ultimately, the only thing Egyptians could worship was the pharaoh himself, and he derived his power from the Aten. Okay? This, quote, monotheistic revolution, unquote, it's the first time it ever happened. And did it ever happen again? No, the pagan religions remained pagan. There were all kinds of gods, right? Were the Romans monotheistic? No, of course not. This is an unusual event. And Egyptologists argue on about what could have possibly caused this, right? This monotheistic revolution can only be adequately explained by the ongoing rage of the pharaonic line, and you can see it must have gotten worse, against Amun for not protecting Egypt against the Hebrew god Yahweh. Not only a new religion, but new artistic styles and new myths came into vogue in the so-called Amarna period. It was in the boy king's reign from age 9 to his sudden death at 19 that the Amarna priesthood and its god Amun regained power. He was born Tutankhaten and died Tutankhamun. All right? You got to know this, right? This is great. You can't make this up, right? Right? You gotta think that this is just a bad novel, right? And this thing here, outside of the pyramids themselves, there's probably nothing that symbolizes ancient Egypt more than the outer death mask, funerary mask of Tutankhamun, right? That shows you what they were capable of producing, right? Oh, you could not possibly have had this thing that's described in Exodus, this wilderness movable temple, right? And all of that stuff, right? The stuff that's described there. That's just reading back into the past, stuff that probably happened under David and Solomon. No. Look at where they came from, right? Well, these two guys were chosen by God and said they'll be the captains of this. And the Spirit of God will go in them and tell them what to do. Now, here we go. British archaeologist Howard Carter, everybody memorize that name, there will be a quiz, discovered the tomb, which he had sought for many years. In November 1922, he opened the tomb. Now, this is really the stuff of legend. He'd been living off of Lord Carnarvon's money for years. And you know what he was looking for all those years? He realized there's a pharaoh in between there. At the end of the 18th dynasty, he was just a kid when he died. There's got to be a tomb. And he was looking for it. And finally, Lord Carnarvon had it and said, this is going to be your last season. This is it. I spent a fortune on you. We've got nothing. You're never going to find this tomb. So that's it. So Howard Carter was looking up at the cliff and he saw the tombs up there. And he realized, you know what, those tombs are later than these tombs down here. There's a lot of rubble. When they cut those tombs out, there's a lot of rubble that's down here at the base of this cliff. And it dawned on him, you know what? Before I'm out of here, what should we do? We should clean some of this rubble out. And one day, a kid who was working on cleaning this rubble out fell on his face. He tripped. He was carrying rubble. He got up to figure out what happened. He tripped on the outer lip of a step that goes down. As soon as Carter saw this nice square lintel, he realized that's a carved stone set into the earth. So right away they started, and they got down, and they found the cartouches of Tutankhamun. And Howard Carter cabled Lord Carnarvon and said, you and your daughter, she was interested, you and your daughter need to come to Egypt, and you need to come to Egypt now. I mean right now. Don't make a big production of it. Don't bring all your servants and so forth. You need to get to Egypt right now. I'm waiting for you. And so Lord Carnarvon was right there when they broke through. Carter had a candle. This is very famous. He put the candle inside. Carnarvon peeked. Do you see anything? Oh, I see beautiful things. Right? He saw the glint of gold. Right? So, all right, so all this, bottom line, is important as a background to the building of the Ark of the Covenant in the first 6 months of Israel's escape from Egypt by God's intervention. And what I'm telling you is, we wouldn't know what was going on except that, no accident, Howard Carter, in the last possible moments, found the tomb. Right? That wasn't an accident. What does the Bible say? Without faith, it is impossible to please God. Okay, here's some misconceptions of the Ark of the Covenant. Look at this one here. It has on the left, it has the rods are going sideways. Well, it says in Kings that the poles stuck out into the holy place when they placed the ark. So they figure, well, it must have gone that way. No. This one on the right, it hasn't overlaid the poles. They're wood. And boy, are they badly placed. Here's this beautiful background, and they've got the thing up there, right? All right. I don't like the one on the right at all.
No.
Okay. Okay. Here's the one on the left, the carrying poles are down at the bottom, and at the right they aren't covering anything, they're up at the top. So take your pick, right? I pointed out that some or many of the implements in Tut's tomb are suspected of having been created much earlier than the early sudden death of the young king at age 19. In November 1922, this is the second time I said it, there will be a quiz. Howard Carter finally found what he'd been looking for over many years. Within a few weeks of what his benefactor Lord Carnarvon had decreed would be his final season, Carter discovered the entrance and found within the many remarkable works from the fabulous 18th dynasty. Anyone interested in the Bible should know the name and date. There will be a quiz. We find the nearly 200 canes of the sickly king. He had a club foot. Right? He is pictured as hunting from his chariot. He could do things expected, but the 200 canes, many of them beautiful, he could not walk without a cane. I get it. Generations of inbreeding fell on Tut's head. He had other problems too. Many other implements gave insight into Egyptian practices and clarified many tomb paintings, including pictures of priests carrying a chest with Egyptian cherubim on top. Did you get that? Priests carrying a chest with Egyptian cherubim on top. Okay, Carter photographed the stuff as it was. There were hundreds of implements. He photographed every single thing. There were little jars with the canopic jars with the organs of the dead king. There were little jars with his stillborn baby girls, right? Carter photographed every implement. You can see it's in black and white. The layers of the mummy, the various sarcophagi, one within another, etc. Among the black and white photos, we find this one of Tut's chest, probably used for travel. Note the carrying poles. All right, there it is as it looks today. If you look real carefully, you can see near the front, you can see a woman looking at you. It's inside a plexiglass case in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. And there are people standing around looking at it, taking photographs of it, of course. So this is what it looks like today. And you see, what are the things at the bottom?
Those are the carrying poles.
Okay, Carter thought this was ingenious. Here's another black and white photo of the bottom of that chest. He photographed it because he knew that you would need to see this. Those four iron implements are not, he just stood them up there. They fit through those brass rings. Do you see the brass rings on both ends that are, and also inside the chest? They're reinforced so they won't tear out, okay? And they're strong. And so you feed these holders in from the inside. And then they have a wide collar. You see there's a wide collar at the end? Why is that there? That's so it won't slip through the rings and you're trying to carry the king's chest with the sacred implements in it, and then the carrying pole falls out. No, this would not be good. They knew what to do. This is the bottom of that chest. All right, now he took this picture. This shows the poles retracted, but they're there. Exodus says the poles always stayed in place on the ark. But then Numbers says the priests had to set up the poles for travel, which is a glaring contradiction. The verb actually means that they prepare the poles for transport, which means what? Pull them out. You don't want those things sticking out when you're going in there on the Day of Atonement, right? Right? I'm preoccupied with not dying here and that Israel being accepted by God, and I fall over the poles because I forgot they were there. This would not be good, right?
Especially if something came out of your mouth that you weren't...
Yes, this is the most sacred moment. You do not want any kind of mistake. The verb actually requires that they prepare the poles for transport. So what do? Pull them out, make sure they're in the right place, make sure that they are stable and everything. And then, of course, they would have to, there were multiple different covers, just like over the sanctuary, that had to go over the ark. Nobody, they didn't carry this thing around where you could look at it, right? Along with the first black and white photo, Carter also had the bottom of the chest photographed. He moved the carrying poles so we could see how they were fitted to the bottom of the chest through brass rings that were reinforced. There it is, okay. Now we go. And here we have a contemporary 18th dynasty explanation of what the ark looked like, and they probably also copied Egyptian cherubim, not our modern misconception, and how it was actually carried, and why the poles were never removed. They didn't need to be. You just pushed them in underneath when the ark was stationary. Egyptian cherubim, remember that IM is a plural, like their Eastern Fertile Crescent images, were often multi-winged protective deities. They sometimes had animal bodies and looked like chariot horses. That's because they were conceived of as pulling God's heavenly chariot. Now this is a, what do we call that? Chimera. Their wings were outstretched and touched each other. Obviously they were fused. It was easier to make this of gold if the wings were united. And we know for sure, when Solomon built the temple, he had these 10-foot high cherubim, exactly like the ones on the ark, and they overshadowed the ark on 4 sides, and their wings were fused together. It says so, right? Only they didn't face downward, they faced outward. So if you came into the temple and you saw there was a step. The temple was built on a slope. The front had to be reinforced. Remember the stone that the builders rejected? Uh-huh. They didn't want it dressed. They thought it would take too much weight. They wanted a natural stone. Okay? But when you went in, this part is built up, you went in, but that part is sitting right on the foundation. So that's up there. You had to go up a staircase to get to the Holy of Holies. Okay? All right, and the first thing you saw was these giant cherubs looking at you. Right? Why were they facing outward? To tell anybody. Right? Mind your P's and Q's. They were, what I'm saying is, they were guardian deities. All right. So what are they? Are they heavenly angels worshiping? Are they guardian deities? Are they steeds to pull the ark? What's the answer? Yeah, that's what they are.
Yep.
All right. Okay, this is... Have you ever heard that King Ahab had an ivory palace? Ivory is made from tusks. What is the likelihood? I know he was a wealthy king. I know he was a powerful king. What is the likelihood that they built an entire palace out of elephant tusks? That's, no, that isn't what happened. That would be a virtual impossibility. Here's what he actually had, plaques inlaid in his palace. This one, that's why we're interested in it, shows a cherub and tells us how the Hebrews envisioned the cherubim in his day. He died in 853 BC. Note the wings. Okay. They lift up the chariot and it flies in Ezekiel. Right? Okay, Elijah goes to heaven in God's chariot. All right, now that doesn't look like anything I saw in the ark. It doesn't matter. This is then, now is misconception time. Right? All right. Oh, by the way, this plaque and many others were not found in Samaria, the capital, or in Jezreel, the winter capital. They weren't found in Israel at all. They were found in the palace of the emperor of Assyria. 723 BC. The Assyrians had it with Israel. And I mentioned 853 BC before that because shortly after the Battle of Karkar, Ahab died. All right. The ark was a miniature of God's throne. In the throne of Tutankhamun and Semiramis-Amun, we see the typical wings on a throne that we would expect. The god does not reside just on earth, but is of the heavens. So we have many mixed Egyptian pictures and icons of the throne and cherubim as chariotry and as fixed furniture and as guardian deities. All are correct. Note that the Pharaoh is seated with his feet on a footstool. Well, we're going to see this in a moment. David called the ark that very footstool. Get the idea that the throne and the footstool belong together as a single unit called throne. It says here the throne had 6 steps and a footstool of gold. 2 Chronicles 9:18. Oh, by the way, note the long rays of the sun. You're going to see this in a moment. Of the sun disk Aten, with little hands caressing the divine couple. The orb at the top center is the Aten. It is the sun disk, okay? And then you see those lines. Well, if you got up close, you would see those lines are, of course, the rays, the sun's rays of the Aten. And at the end, if you could see this close enough, you would see that each ray has a little hand caressing the king and queen, right? So the Aten gives his blessing to them, and you worship them. Okay? And notice that, we're so interested, notice his feet are on a footstool. Not hers, his. Okay? We're so interested in this, so we should at least stop to say, this is also gorgeous work, right? Now, this is from the side. We have to do this from the side. The chariot image is there, and also something about flying. You see the throne has wings on both sides. And notice the wings are a winged serpent. Do you see that the serpent's head?
Yep.
And notice there's a serpent facing us.
Yeah, see that.
Let's go back here. Let's go back a ways. See how far back I have to go. Do you see the serpent? Yeah. So those two symbols are the symbols of Upper and Lower Egypt. Okay? One of which was a serpent. Okay. A winged serpent was one of the symbols from the iconography of the Hebrews. That would mean they were under the control of Satan. Right? Okay. All right. There is identification between the seraphim, the burning ones, and the cherubim. The servants are carved ones, cut ones. Of the guardian seraphim above the Lord at Isaiah's call, we read, above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face. With 2 he covered his feet, that is his genitals. And with 2 he flew. These wings were inside of each other. And the guardian deities surrounding the throne of God in heaven, we read, and the 4 living creatures, each of them with 6 wings, are full of eyes all around and within. Okay? So now wait. What are the living beings at the throne of God in Revelation 4 and 5? Are they guardian deities or heavenly beings? Or are they... We had this thing of the war camp of Israel, and they're the chief tribes on the compass points. Do they represent God's people, or are they representing the angelic host that protects the throne of God? Which is it? The answer is yes. Okay. The cherubim shall spread out their wings above, overshadowing the mercy seat. We're going to talk about that in a moment. With their wings, their faces one to another, toward the mercy seat shall the faces of the cherubim. So they're facing downward. Unlike the giant cherubim in Solomon's temple, which was facing at you when you went in, they are facing downward in a worshipful, reverent state. The wings actually touch and are a single piece of gold, together with the lid they sit on. Their downcast eyes indicate their submission to the one whose throne they guard. Moses then told, there I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the 2 cherubim, are the that are on the Ark of the Testimony, notice, it's the Ark of the Testimony. It's a different word, right? The Ten Commandments are what God has testified to. They've heard his testimony. I will speak with you about all that I will give you in commandment for the people of Israel. All right? By now it should be obvious that the Ark of the Covenant serves the dual function of being the footstool of the throne in heaven and a complete symbol of the throne all unto itself when considered alone. While the Ten Commandments were given by God in thunder from Sinai, their amplification came from the throne in the sanctuary. The lid to which the cherubim is attached is called the mercy seat here, and more than 24 times in the law. In fact, the ark is seldom mentioned without the detail of the mercy seat which is above it. That tells you that's a really important factor, that mercy seat thing. Actually, mercy seat is not really what God said to Moses. Looking at its function as he translated the Bible into German, Martin Luther came up with the term mercy seat, which obviously is stuck, right? The actual word is kafort, which is based on the verb kafer, which literally means to cover. Hence, the actual meaning of Yom Kippur in English is the day covered, the day of coveredness. I put it that way. It's a perfect infinitive. It's hard to translate. We'll just call it the day of covering, of having been covered. It's not quite the way we would use English. Which originally meant covered with bitumen, pitch. Remember the ark, the little thing that Moses floated down the Nile in? She covered it with pitch, so it wouldn't sink. Okay. So originally it meant to be covered with pitch. From the ritual came the concept of covering sin and hence propitiation or atonement. So we say the Day of Atonement. Literally, the Day of Covering. So the ark was both a throne, a seat, the point where final atonement was made, both. But that's the outside story. There's also an inside story. The ark was a chest with a removable lid. You could put things inside. Now, the people who made this knew it was a chest. Whose chest was it? It was God's. If you did put things inside, those would be things that were personal items of God's. The sanctuary was his house, as it were. And things were put inside. First, 2 tables written on both sides, 2 tables of stone written on both sides. The first and foremost thing, of course, was the Decalogue, the 10 words, or later the 10 Commandments, or the testimony, of which 2 identical copies were made. This is important. And you should put the mercy seat on the top of the ark, and in the ark you should put the testimony that I will give you. When did God testify? When he spoke. Further on we hear that you're going to obey the covenant and you will obey the voice of God. The voice of God was only heard once in the giving of the Decalogue. That's what it's got to mean. And I will write on the tables, the tablets, the words that were on the first. Remember, Moses came down from the mountain, found them worshiping a golden calf. He threw them on the ground and smashed them. He was in a rage, and they knew they were in deep trouble. A lot of people were going to die that day. And so, and what God didn't, there was nothing wrong with that. It was perfectly appropriate. I will write, says, come on up here, I'll do it over, on the tablets, the words that were on the first tablets that you broke, and you shall put them in the ark. And there they are, as Yahweh commanded me, Moses says. Okay? Good. This is absolutely not the long tablets with the rounded tops that you've seen on the outside of synagogues and all over the places all over the world. Right? Is there anybody who doesn't actually know what the 2 tables of stone are? Right? Sometimes they just have Roman numerals to indicate, oh, that's the Ten Commandments. Right? Yeah. You don't need to be an exegetical genius to know, oh, that's the Ten Commandments. No, it isn't. Mm-mm. Then Moses turned and went down from the mountain with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand. Tablets that were written on both sides, on the front and on the back they were written. That's pretty emphatic, right? That's real clear. All right. He held them in his hand. Oh, what you usually see, he's like, in fact, the law, that's the way the Statue of Liberty is holding it. That came from this passage. Well, it's big, right? So he's got it like this. No, that's not what it says. How did he hold them? Right, Moses turned with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand. Couldn't the author have said hands? He didn't mean that. These small square tablets were written on both sides. That is, each tablet had the first 4 commands on the front, the so-called obverse, and the other 6 on the back, the reverse. The 2 were duplicates. 1 tablet for God, 1 for Israel. Nothing about the first 4 on this tablet, the second on that. No, that's all wrong. Wouldn't the first 4 be shorter, considering 6 were on the back? No. The first 4 are elaborated beyond the 10 words. Elaborated. First, there were 10 words. Then God talked to Moses and said, I want you to, the 10 words that are elaborated give us about 3 times as much written material on the front than on the back. What do we mean by elaboration? Let's look at the Decalogue as just the 10 words. No other gods. Now the way that you've got a verb here with a negative in front of it, which is just an L, just a lamed, and in some cases a direct object. No other gods, no idols, no vain speech. Vain speech would be speech using God's name. No forgetting Sabbath. Front side, each of these has extensive elaboration. Back side, no dishonoring parents, no murder or manslaughter. That word means both murder or manslaughter, whether you intended to kill somebody or not. Killing somebody in the wars of Yahweh was not murder or manslaughter, right? Okay. No adultery, no theft, no false testimony, no coveting. Minimal elaboration. It does say something about honoring parents so that you can live a long time, right? That's about all the elaboration you get. No coveting is expanded into, let me give you examples of what I don't want you to covet. And it's all stuff that somebody living in a tent might covet, right? These are not adapted to our situation. And Jesus made the law spiritual, right? He said, well, it says this, but this is the real implication, right? All right, now, this is 1 tablet. This is not 2 tablets. Stay with me here, people. This is 1 tablet. There's a front side and a back side, right? Now, ancient kings often told you, you better do this or else I'll have you killed. And very often they would tell you all the wonderful things they did. They would tell you lots of stuff. But always, whether it's at the top or at the bottom, there was always a recitation of who this king is, what his authority is, what he rules over, so forth. The mighty acts are always recounted. This is, when you get somebody whose exploits cover a whole wall in the Karnak temple, you're not talking about a minor pharaoh. You're talking about a major guy. Right? And it's going to tell you who this king is and what he did and what his greatness is, what he rules over. It's going to tell you, the Assyrian king may say that I'm the king of kings. Now look, King Darius the Great had people go up and hang from a cliff 300 feet up, 30 stories high, and carve out a big picture of himself in his chariot and all the wonderful things he had done, and how important he was, and how you dare not ever think about disobeying him because you're on his territory. Okay. I think that Bayeston cliff was wrecked by the ISIS people. I'm not sure that it remains intact, but anyway, there's plenty of pictures of it. This British lieutenant knew how important that was. He wanted to get copies of it so he could translate it and tell us what it said. He went up there with paper mache and he wet it and squeezed it into the carvings in the cliff. And it took him ages, hanging up there all day long on a rope, on a 19th century rope, and he got it done. And that's why we know today what it said. So the mighty acts are recounted. And if you see the front side here, what did God do? I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt with an outstretched hand. You shall have no other gods before me. Okay, there's the law. The mighty act that is recounted is, I am Yahweh your God who took you by the hand and delivered you from Egypt. Okay. Now, we would expect somewhere in this law, if it's like the way ancient law was done, that there would be an identification of the authority of whoever is speaking here to require you to obey this. We have in the black obelisk where King Jehu is down on the ground on his forehead before the Assyrian emperor. We have many of the walls of the Karnak temple, the Bayeston cliff. This is common stuff. You're going to have both mighty acts, a law, and the authority by which this king can order you to do this stuff. The fourth commandment concerns God as creator or redeemer of all mankind, not just the Hebrews, and therefore one who has authority to demand obedience of all mankind. Oh, the Pharisees got all Twitter-pated because one Saturday morning, crossing a grain field, some of his hungry disciples grabbed some heads of wheat that was ready to be harvested and rubbed them in their hands and blew the chaff away and chewed the wheat. Well, there was a problem, wasn't there? What was the problem?
Working on the Sabbath.
They worked on the Sabbath. That's why the Sabbath had to be stopped. It was the very essence of legalism. If you kept the Sabbath and it was passed on to you by the Jews and you learned how to think about it, you would be taught to think that you're likely to be saved or lost based on how well you do this. Right? It was the very essence of salvation by works. Right? And that had to be canceled for the time being. That doesn't mean it wasn't important or it wasn't powerful, but the Holy Spirit never impressed on the church that they got lots of things right. Even as they were developing Catholicism, mixing Roman paganism with the gospel, even as that was happening, they still got right the nature of Christ. No, it wasn't made. He's true God from true God. He's light from light. Begotten but not made. They got it exactly right. The Holy Spirit is the only way they could have gotten that correct with all of the heresies that came up around it, all the misunderstandings you could have. right? But the Holy Spirit never told the church, even in the Reformation. You know, it's important that you think about the Sabbath. Right? And yet Jesus said the Sabbath was made for man. This is not an answer. Man is not the servant of the Sabbath. The Sabbath is a servant of man. It's for rest, right? For worship of God. The Sabbath was made for man, he said. I thought it was made for the Jews. No, Jesus didn't teach that. And he really worked hard to get them to understand what the Sabbath was about. Look, he could have said to the man, do you want to walk? He'd never been able to walk. He told Jesus, I've been sitting here since I was a kid. I've been sitting here for 38 years. When the angel comes down and stirs the water, no angel came down and stirred the water. It was a spring. And in the spring, the aquifer filled up, and so it started bubbling up. And the idea was that whoever got in after that started would be healed. And I think a lot of people were healed. You know why? A lot of disease is psychological.
Yeah.
If some guy thought he was going to be healed and he won the lottery, what would he do? Say, oh, good, I'm not sick anymore. Now about the law, we know that the elaboration of the fourth commandment in the full text of the Bible was later than the original spoken law, simply because the elaboration explains the importance of the Sabbath in two different ways. In one, the authority for imposing the law was that the Creator, Sustainer God was giving the law. And the other, the Redeemer, Rescuer God was giving the law, which is correct. Once again, it's yes. The law operates on several levels. This, in fact, is the second level. Elsewhere in the law, the original single facet of the law stated very clearly, self-sacrificing love. What's the law of God? Self-sacrificing love. This single principle is then extended into two parts: supreme love for God and selfless love for one's neighbor. Okay, so now we've got arrows pointing in two different directions. Now we have the front and the back of the tablet. Each of these two principles is then elaborated in the Decalogue as we now have it. Finally, these two principles are elaborated extensively in particular cases. That's called case law, casuistic law. Okay? If a man, this is a case. If a man digs a pit and he doesn't put a fence around it, and somebody comes along and falls in and is killed, well, that's considered murder. This is a specific case. It's illustrating what is meant by no murder. Okay? And I can give you lots of other cases, because each of the Ten Commandments has lots of cases in the law of Moses that amplify what the Ten Commandments say. Okay?
As in it spells out in great detail what the general law was implying.
Yes. The general law is called apodictic. Apodictic law means it applies in all cases. Apo means across. It's a law that covers everything. It's a general statement. Casuistic law, apodictic and casuistic. Casuistic law, as you can tell by the sound, is case law. Let me give you a case that illustrates what this is about. Let me give you 20 cases, just so it's clear. All right? So, the two principles elaborated extensively in particular cases. All those additional case laws were given to Moses from God appearing to him above the Ark of the Covenant. Paul tells us that all this extensive elaboration was given because of sins. What does he mean by that? He says, look, God made a covenant with Abraham. It was in Isaac and Jacob. It was based on their faith. Now we've got a bunch of laws. Why? Why something coming after that has all this stuff attached to it? Well, he says it's because of sins. Israel, long in slavery, did not have any spiritual sense. Their minds had been dulled by constant relationship to Egyptian paganism, with gods that were repugnant, beetles, frogs, snakes, various chimerae. You had to be careful when you were walking along. What might happen? Oh my goodness, if you stepped on a dung beetle and smashed it to bits, if anybody saw you, you might be killed. Frogs, snakes. You couldn't go crush a snake, right? If that snake bit you, then the god is mad at you. If it didn't and slithered away, then you praised that god because he was happy with you at that moment. And they were completely immoral. That was their gods. That's what they worshipped. As slaves, they had no idea of basic life principles. Family law told them who not to have sex with. No, don't have sex with your mother-in-law. That's not a good thing. Don't have sex with your daughter. That's not a good thing. Yeah, but the pharaohs do it. Yeah, that's why you're not there. Health laws told them when and what to wash, what to eat, to go outside the camp to defecate, take a stick to cover it, which even the desert cats knew by instinct. Really? You had to tell them that? Well, God made a promise to Abraham. He's keeping the promise. And you have to start somewhere. Was that first generation ever going to make it to Canaan? No, it was never going to make it to Canaan.
Not gonna happen.
No, it was never going to make it to Canaan. They weren't equipped for that. Well, why did he stay with them during the 40? Because that's how you learn, by experience. And that's what they lacked, experience. There's a rule. There's no substitute for experience, right? The two identical tablets with the minimal requirements, you can do anything, but don't do this short list of things. What are deposited within the ark itself? One is God's copy of the Decalogue, the other is for Israel. The priest could take that out. Moses could take it out, right? In its basic format, this arrangement is a suzerainty covenant where continued life and blessing is based on obedience. Since perfect obedience was never possible under that covenant, the sprinkling of blood on the kaphoret, that's the place there of covering, was the imposition of a substitute life instead of the forfeit life of the Israelites themselves. So now we have two tablets of the broken law deposited within the ark, where blood would later be imposed to allow Israel to live after having broken the covenant law. And I will write on the tablets the words that were on the first tablets that you broke, and you shall put them in the ark. That the law for both parties was deposited in the ark, that is, under God's throne, makes perfect sense. But there were other things put into the ark. Remember, this was also a chest to store things that belonged to God. And the Ark of the Covenant, this is just a summary from Hebrews. Instead of putting 3 long verses, I just chose this one. This is from Hebrews. And the Ark of the Covenant overlaid round about with gold, wherein was the golden pot that had manna, and Aaron's rod that budded, and the tables of the covenant. Okay? So the covenant is the 10 Commandments. Okay? The 10 Commandments are the covenant. Everything else is just elaboration about the 10 Commandments. The budded rod exemplified that Aaron, and he alone, had the priestly family. The budding of a dead rod indicated God's sole ability to create and sustain life. Yeah, they put the rod in there at night, and it came back. It was an almond rod, so it budded and it grew almonds in the night. In fact, the manna made exactly the point. What is manna? Ma is just the Hebrew word what. And the na is what's called an enclitic. It means anything. It appears all through. Okay, when I'm just trying to refer to something, you just put a na there. So literally, what does that say? It said, what is it? How did that get to be the name? I bet so many people said, what is it? That it became the name. And it was really good stuff. I like potatoes, you know. You can French fry a potato. You can bake a potato. You can boil a potato. You can mash a potato. Wow.
Butter right behind.
Yeah, you know. Yeah. I like that ability. That's what manna was like. All right. God not only creates life, but is perfectly capable of sustaining it, even in a wilderness. Further, Moses was to add the law, thus, take this book of the law and put it by the side of the ark. Well, that sounds like it was outside, just kind of sitting on the floor, which is weird. Except that it turns out that this word side is usually used to indicate the left side as opposed to the right side. Which is the dominant side?
Right.
The right side, of course. There was a dreadful silence from over on that side of the room. Okay, so look, I put the law over here on the right side because what? That's the most important. But Deuteronomy is an elaboration, so what?
It goes
Put it on the left side. Okay, then it may be there for a witness. Otherwise, you have this really odd picture of the entire book of Deuteronomy just sitting on the ground somewhere near the ark. That the Decalogue is an elaborated form, no longer the 10 words only, was in the ark for both covenants, both Sinai and Moab, and any covenant thereafter. It's the ark of the covenant, is problematic because one of those commandments was no longer applied rigorously at the time Revelation was written. Right? You'll remember from the Gospels, especially John, the constant complaint against Christ was that he broke the Sabbath. He himself explained that his Father and he himself worked on the Sabbath. He actually used the word. They came and said, "You're working." He said, "Yeah, that's right." That's not a strong argument. Well, it is if you accept his basic argument that he is God, right? He'd already done that. No wonder they thought strange things, right? He said before Abraham was, I am. That's the name of God. They took up stones because they said he blasphemed. He made himself equal to God. Yes. And he broke the Sabbath. It adds those two together. From their viewpoint, what? From their viewpoint, what?
He was a blasphemer.
He was a blasphemer who also broke the Sabbath. That's because of how they thought about the Sabbath. And did I say earlier, did I mention that breaking a religious tradition is the hardest thing to do? See, the problem was the Jews had, their Hebrew ancestors had gone toward paganism all the time. Then they had the exile. They weren't going to make that mistake again. So what did they do?
Pendulum went the other way.
They are way over here. They have no relation to the rest of the world. All right. He tried to explain that works of love and mercy did not break the Sabbath. Healing a lifelong cripple was not a breach of Sabbath rest. Of course, the Lord made this point by telling the man, take up your pallet and walk. He could have said what?
Come back after sundown, pick up your pallet.
Yeah. Or you're not going to need this anymore. Just go walk, go home.
Yeah.
Right? He could have said, just go home.
Yep.
He knew the route. He was carried there all the time. Right? And unfortunately, the short way that he was carried was through the temple. So here he is on a Sabbath with huge crowds, with horror being expressed all around him because what? He's unconsciously walking along, carrying this rolled up bedroll, right? Carrying a burden on the Sabbath. Jesus planned this very public event to teach not only the leaders but the masses gathered in the temple courts what the Sabbath was about. Some people began to hate him.
People protecting their turf.
Yeah, right, exactly. Even Pilate figured that out in about 2 minutes. The lessons Christ intended to teach did not take. The leaders and most of the people refused to listen. In the Jerusalem Council described in Acts 15, the leaders met to decide what parts of the covenant the Gentile Christians should be required to keep. The Apostle James, the stepbrother of Christ, the oldest living male of the line of David, presided. Though a strict Pharisee, his decision by the Spirit, he said that, was that the Gentiles needed to be guided only by the guidelines given in the covenant God made to Noah. They were to lead quiet lives and abstain from blood. That one had a double meaning. They should not eat blood and should not shed blood either. Why did God destroy the antediluvian world? It says in Genesis, because of the violence. Their profession of Christ already meant their lives might be forfeited as martyrs, and they knew that when they accepted Jesus as Lord. Their exclusion of pagan gods earned them great hatred that alone fulfilled the goal of Sabbath keeping. The decision left a question: what about the provision of the covenant at Sinai? What especially about Sabbath keeping? Did it still apply? Of course, the Christians of Jewish background continued in Sabbath observance until the 4th century with its new imperial Sunday law. The author of Hebrews took up the question about the content of the covenant at Sinai and later covenants. He contrasted them by pointing out there was indeed a fault with the covenant at Sinai. But modern dispensationalists, nearly all Protestants, have missed completely what the fault actually was. They say there's a fault with the content. Now, mind you, Christians don't have an issue with naturally observing the other 9 commandments. Right? Does any Christian say you can commit adultery? That doesn't matter. No, they're really strict about some of these things. It is the observance of the 7th day as the Sabbath that becomes an issue. The Sabbath is a testament to the literal creation of the human race in 7 literal days, which is alien to modern thought, even among alleged believers. Okay, let's review. Here's what he says is the problem. This is the author of Hebrews. For he finds fault with them when he says, there's fault, but who's it with? It's with the people. He then goes on to quote the entirety of Jeremiah 31:31 and following about the new covenant whose law is written on the hearts of believers. That's the longest piece of the Old Testament quoted in the New. What was wrong with the them of the Sinai covenant? He'd already explained the problem. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises. There you have it. All right, it is not the content of either covenant, but the promises that underlie them. All right. Now let me ask again, what is the ark? What is the ark? It's the ark of what?
The law.
Of the covenant.
Ark of the
What did
covenant.
we see a passage earlier say the covenant was? The Decalogue. Everything else is elaboration. Don't tell me about the old covenant and tell me about, circumcision or anything like that. No, don't do that. I've got it. The 10 Commandments are it. And we don't have an argument between you and me about 9 of them. Right?
Right.
All the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. I've never asked anyone who should know how the answer when people made that promise. Everyone assumes it was after the law. If I don't point it out, you're going to say it wrong. But no, the Decalogue is spoken by God in Exodus 20. This is the preparation in Exodus 19, without a clue as to the high and holy plan God had for them. And without knowing that they could not keep the law in human strength anyway, they ignorantly promised to obey. The rest of the story is one long disaster after disaster as they failed repeatedly. By contrast, note the new covenant, and when all these things come upon you in the blessing and the curse which I have set before you, and you call them to mind among all the nations where the Lord your God has driven you, and return to the Lord your God, you and your children, and obey his voice, in all that I command you today, with all your heart and all your soul. And the Lord your God will circumcise your heart, and the heart of your offspring, so that you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul, that you may live. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them. Has the law changed? No. And I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. That's the description of the Messianic kingdom. That isn't promising that every Jew in the last days will be saved. My colleague Randy has reminded me that though this concept is thoroughly Old Testament idea or ideal, it did not happen then. Only when he came, whose responsibility it was, did the new covenant become effective. The new covenant required that Christ come. Christ offered himself in our behalf and then opened to us the gift of the Holy Spirit to dwell within us and enable us to grow in grace to the point of obeying. Note that the Decalogue is what we come to obey. Of course, laws like building a wall on your property around dangerous pits or covering excrement weren't at issue. The law was spiritual. You should know all that. As they grew from slaves into an insightful, holy nation of priests, those laws would become irrelevant, as would ceremonies that looked forward to the sacrifice of Christ. That done, the author of Hebrews is anxious to say that Christian priests should not be serving in the temple and sacrificing sheep and goats now that the great sacrifice had been made. There's nothing in this that suggests that the Sabbath was not a part of the new covenant. When obeying the voice of God, the very phrase, whether in written revelation of the law, written of the circumcised heart, the new covenant believer would delight in proclaiming the special creation of mankind in a real literal week. The Sabbath was not really relevant to Abraham or to Jacob. They were worshippers of the one God without any hesitation or confusion. Their descendants, fresh from the deceitful religion of Egypt, needed exactly the constant relevance and repetition of the Sabbath. We live in a world not unlike theirs. The man in the street, the vast majority the world over, believes mankind came to be by a process of evolutionary upward growth. Even Christians. That belief is the ultimate outcome of Charles Darwin's The Origin of the Species in 1859. In this new context that wasn't there in the Jerusalem Council, that wasn't there when Revelation was written, what wasn't there in the councils that the church fathers held, it wasn't there in the Reformation. This new context, the Sabbath becomes relevant again, upholding the power of the Creator. The sudden appearance of the Ark of the Covenant as the capstone of the two witnesses and the great re-prophesying reminds us that what is happening at the end of the age is a complete assault on God's authority. In the new covenant, that law is to be written on the heart by God himself. Is it maybe a mistake that maybe this verse is attached to the next chapter, and the monk who did this in the 9th century just made a mistake, and it has nothing to do with chapters 10 and 11. All you need to do is read the first verse of chapter 12 and you realize, nope, the ark has nothing to do with this. This starts way back with the woman standing on the moon and clothed with the sun and 12 stars is about to have a child. And it's the beginning of the story of the gospel and how Satan had planned to destroy it. So next we turn to the controversy between good and evil from the time of Christ's birth forward to the end. The ark reminds us that all of this stuff that you've been reading about is about God's authority. And what is the ark? It's the Ark of the Covenant, God's chest that has his law. 9/10 of which the Christian world accepts. But the one that you reject is the one about his authority. Oh, that's a bad place to choose something easier. Maybe you have bad parents. Throw out the commandment about honoring your parents. Or maybe you really would like to have your neighbor's house. So throw out that one. Throw out something that's virtually meaningless. Don't throw out the fourth commandment. All right, so now we will next turn to the controversy between good and evil and trace it forward from Christ's birth to the end. Thank you for his attention. Now I'd like to give you something here. I want you to listen with me as I say this. And now, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and give you peace.